incredibly important. It's incredibly important as an employee. It's incredibly important as a brand, and it's incredibly important in standing out even from a user experience perspective. If you talk to a scientist, if you go to the next slide, Billy, they would say predictive coding. This is the brain uses more neural activity to process new information than it does for things that we're familiar with. And so if I had to say this in plain English, if you go to the next slide, it essentially says, and I'll preface this, it essentially says that your brain uses more neural activity for something new than it does for something old. Or as it says here, when you learn something new or different, your brain deems it as more important. And even as a small example of this, just on this slide, whether you realize it or not, your brain is telling you that the green square is more important than the white circles. Well, it's completely out of your control, but your brain is by its own command telling you there's something going on with that green square, and pay more attention to it. And this is a very simple example of the power of differentiation. But if you go to the next slide, we'll bring it into practical use here. And this is where I'd like folks to fire up the chat. Does anybody know that's out there, what do these three resorts, winter resorts, have in common? And I will pause and see if people can tell me what these three resorts have in common. And Billy or Jordana, let me know if there's any chat here.
I have in Idaho. Good guess, but not completely true. Don't Allow Snowboarders by Claire Fallon.
Oh, look at Claire. That's correct. So these three resorts do not allow snowboarders, and this makes them fundamentally different. And as you could imagine, if you are a snowboarder, you know, what would you feel about these resorts if you were a snowboarder? Would you like them? Would you not like them? Conversely, if you're a skier, what would you like and what would you feel about these three resorts? But the purpose of this exercise is to, okay, now that you know this, now that you know that there's Alta, Deer Valley, and Mad River Glen, if you go down a couple months, get in a time machine and go forward 3 or 4 months, do you think you've got a better chance of remembering one of these three resorts now that you know that they actively prohibit snowboarders from getting on their property? And these three resorts made a very, very conscious decision to prohibit snowboarders, and they are comfortable with that decision, and that makes them different. You know, one's in Utah, actually 2 are in Utah, and one's on the East Coast, but they're okay with that. And this is the very, very micro lesson in differentiation, which it helps you remember, and it helps you stand out, and it helps you appeal to certain groups, and it has consequences as well. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to walk you through the largest longitudinal brand study on the planet. It's a methodology called Brand Asset Valuator, and it has been in existence for 30 years. It's got 40,000 brands, probably the single largest brand study. And this is going to get inside a little bit of what I call the science of brand management. And what it does is, if you go to the next slide, it evaluates brands on 4 different criteria. Number 1 is, how different is this brand? What is the brand's point of differentiation? The second criteria is, how relevant is this brand? The third is, how prestigious in some way, or how much high regard do you have for this brand? And then the fourth, which is probably related to traditional brand awareness, is do you know what this brand is? Do you know what this brand does? And you can evaluate a brand on each of these dimensions. And there are some brands, as you can imagine, that do incredibly well on all of them. So take a brand like Google, take a brand like BMW, Louis Vuitton. They do very, very well across all these dimensions. But as we go forward to the next slide, I want to fire up the chat on a couple of these because I want to get everybody's creative juices flowing. If you go to the next slide, I'd like to get some feedback from the group of name some brands that you think are highly differentiated. And I've given you a couple thought starters here, but name a brand that you think is really, really different relative to the alternatives that are out there. And I'm going to take a sip of my coffee, and everybody can input. And Billy, let me know. And I want to thank Billy for doing the chat management here. He's an old friend of mine. If you can imagine that he convinced me to do this, you must realize how much dirt Billy has over me that he can get me to do this in the middle of the workday. So, so Billy, please let me know what comes through the chat.
Okay. Spotify, Patagonia,
Perfect.
Apple,
RIP
Sonos, Rolls-Royce.
I like it. All right, so let's keep the momentum going. Let's go to the next slide, and we're going to start to get through it. Now name brands that you think are really, really relevant. And here, think of brands that are crazy ubiquitous, that have massive market share. And so I put brand like Ziploc, Visa, Starbucks. So I want to fire up the chat and give me some brands you think are crazy relevant, that are everywhere, that everybody uses.
Nike,
Boom,
Tesla,
boom.
BMW, T-Mobile, Rolex, Dior.
Dior. Wow, I like that. Somebody's pretty high heel thinking that they're everywhere. I like it.
Starbucks,
Atlo, hi Jonathan.
Clorox, PayPal, H&M, Airbnb. Is that enough?
I've got a lot of skeletons in my closet attending this call today.
Instagram, Zara, McDonald's.
I love it. Let's go to the next one. So Billy, this is a fun one. I think we got a couple of these on the earlier one, which is name some brands that you think are held in incredibly high regard. All right, we got an Arc'teryx lover, Heineken, Amex Black Card, Porsche. What are some other ones?
Let's see. We've got Google,
Heineken,
Apple again, Wynn
Google.
Resorts, Lamborghini, Hermes, Loro Piana, Bottega Veneta, Loro Piana again.
We won't hold it against Billy that he doesn't have a lot of highfalutin names in his closet. That's okay.
Rolex
right,
again, Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs, perfect.
BlackRock. We got a BlackRock.
That's good. That's your company. All right, let's go to the final one before we get into the meat of the presentation here. This is just a warm up. All right. Love it, Jack. All right, group 4, knowledge. So these are brands that nearly everybody's familiar with. Name a couple brands that are just absolutely familiar. You know exactly what they are. I put United Airlines, mac and cheese, and Bluetooth as my examples, but fire up the chat with some examples that are not.
Red Bull, Procter & Gamble,
Red
Levi's, Amex, Viagra. Well, that's Eli Lilly, who makes Viagra.
Viagra's a brand too. They're a tough guy.
That's true. Clorox, Kleenex, Costco.
Kleenex is a excellent example.
Airbnb, Starbucks, Toyota.
All right.
YouTube.
Okay, so with this little warm up complete, we're going to get into the meat of this presentation. YouTube's a great one. I brought a little bit earlier in terms of why differentiation, but now I really want to get into the science of brand management. And so if we go to the next slide here, this is a chart of brand growth. And so I'm going to walk you through on the left-hand side. So if you're a new brand, the very first thing that you have as a new aspiring brand is differentiation. And so you grow up. So the very first thing a brand has on the way up is differentiation. If you look up in the upper right side, remember when I talked about BMW and Google and Louis Vuitton, these leadership brands, these power brands, they have all 4 dimensions of their brands are strong. However, if you start to see as brands start to erode, the very first thing they lose is differentiation. So I'll just try and put a sharp point on that. A brand on the way up requires differentiation to rise. And the very first thing that a failing brand loses on the way down is differentiation. And this is why I ask companies and brands all the time to focus on differentiation almost more than any other attribute. Awareness will come over time, but differentiation you need to really keep your eye on. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about a company that I think most people on this call are familiar with, and that's Under Armour. And so Under Armour, if you go to the next slide, they were started in 1996, and they had an idea, a very different idea, which was for football. What if you had this tight-fitting layer to reduce friction between yourself and your football pads, i.e. your armor? And it would allow you to wick sweat away, move quickly, and be more comfortable on the battlefield of football. And they came up with this thing, the prototype 0037, the Shorty. And it took off like wildfire. And if you go to the next slide, by 2010, they were $1 billion brand. Their most famous product placement was probably on Friday Night Lights. And they became, because they were fundamentally different, they had a very niche idea, they became $1 billion brand. I believe their founder is Kevin Plank. If you go to the next slide, I want to give a brief lesson in both differentiation and what I call egonomics, which is the role that ego plays in economics. And after Under Armour was a very, very large $1 billion brand, they had gone public. Their founder purchased a full floor, multi-million-dollar condominium at the Montage in Deer Valley. And he decided that he would like to wake up every day and have the Deer Valley Ski School and the Deer Valley Ski Patrol and the Deer Valley lift attendants all be wearing what brand? Under Armour. And so Under Armour decided to get into the ski business. Now, if I can ask, do you think that you could come up with a type of clothing that is more different than a thin, frictionless underlayer that fits on your skin between that and your football armor and thick, bulky ski clothing? I think it would be hard pressed to come up with 2 polar opposites of clothing. Well, something happened. They made all the ski clothing for the ski patrols. They made it for ski schools. And within days, it started to come apart at the seams. And they had 5 container loads of it because ski instructors need 5 different outfits for a week. They're doing this all day long. All needed to be returned. If you go to the next slide, that's Under Armour stock price. And I think this is an incredible example of where differentiation plays an incredible role on the way up, and an acute example of it going away on the way down. Under Armour completely forgot what made them special and decided to get into everything, making basketball shoes, ski equipment, anything, tennis rackets. They decided that they could take their brand, forget what made them special, forget to leverage the equities of the products and services that got them there. And this is the result. And they're on their 3rd or 4th CEO, and they're scrambling to try and find relevancy again. And if I can editorialize, this is exactly what's going on with Nike right now. If you're following Nike stock price and the amount of market cap that has been wiped out, and you see the changes that they've made, you know, Nike was a running company, always has been a running company. And they pulled all of their best running shoes out of stores and made them buy them direct from them. Whereas Hoka, On Running, and a lot of other companies are now making sure that you can buy a Hoka at any running store. You can buy the best Hokas at running stores. You can buy them at a wide variety of places. And Nike is now experiencing the same thing because they've walked away from the one thing that makes them special, which is running, and other companies are filling that void. So let's get into it. Let's go to the next slide. The other aspect of why differentiation that is incredibly important, and it is particularly important for the growth hackers community, and that is how easy it is or difficult it is to achieve with scarce resources. And it's one of my favorite definitions of strategy, and that is that it's the allocation of scarce resources. And I think many startups do not have abundant resources or abundant time. And so if you go to the next slide, if you look across these 4 dimensions, Bill, you can go to that next slide there. If you go across these 4 dimensions, let's go to the next slide. If you want to be relevant, so let's talk about what was brought up earlier, Viagra. That's great, might be incredibly relevant. Took tons of time and R&D to make that happen. Same thing with something like the Wii video game to get people off their sofas. Very, very relevant, but lots of R&D, lots of time. If you go over to Esteem, go to the next slide. So let's look at the brands that have real high esteem, brands that are held in really high regard. Brands like Rolex, brands like Louis Vuitton, brands like Porsche, brands like Goldman Sachs. They have spent decades, if not centuries, on quality control and have spent tons and tons and tons of money to get there. And then finally, if you go to the third column, or the last column over, knowledge, which are how are brands that are universally understood, brands like Red Bull or Bluetooth or things like that, they have existed for a long time and they have spent a ton of money getting known. People talked about Walmart. How many stores did they have to build to have that kind of ubiquity? And so there is a huge common denominator here. And I say this within the context of growth hackers and moving forward, say, look, it would be nice to have high relevance, high esteem, high knowledge. But if you take them collectively, if you go to the next slide, time and money. And I know most of the corporate context that I've worked in and the startup context that I've worked in, but these are 2 things that we typically don't have an abundance of. And so if you want to drive brand health, if you want to drive attention and demand for your business, the path towards differentiation is often much, much easier. And so if you go to the next slide, the shortest example, with a little bit of courage and creativity, you can get this done incredibly quickly. And I think, I know liquid death is a little bit of an overused example, but it's water in a can. And they were able to penetrate a market as a niche player and do so incredibly effectively by just being different. There has been water in a can before. That's not new. Water in a container is not new. But they were able to do it pretty effectively. So the reason I say this is because differentiation allows you to create demand for your product in a way that can be done very quickly and without a lot of money. If you go to the next slide, but most importantly, it goes to this. Yes, it can be done quickly. Yes, it can be done without a lot of money. But most importantly, if you want to grow, you must have it. And if you want to stay on top, you must keep it. And so this is why I say it's the lost art of differentiation. So many people have lost sight of this. And you see it every day. You see it with the largest brands on the planet. We're seeing it with Nike. We saw it with Under Armour. You see it every day. And so I like it when I'm talking to a young emerging company to teach them this early, because it gives them the toolkits to grow and it gives them the tools to maintain. If we go to the next slide, I want to just spend a bit of time, and this will be interactive as well, which is, what are all the possible different ways to differentiate? And so fire up the chat here as well. If you go to the next slide, product design can be different. So I got a Yeezy slide here, which is, you can take or leave whether or not you like it, but it's certainly a different product design. Anybody else think of a fundamentally different product design that is different from the alternatives in the marketplace? I'm going to take a sip of coffee. Billy, you let me know if anything comes through. If not, I'll keep going. All right, I'm going to keep going. Let's go to the next slide. So you've got product design. For some reason I don't see Bill anymore, so I worry that maybe Slack. Perfect example. Thank you, Alex. Product advertising. Roomba, love it. Advertising can be different. This was originally one of the things, Crocs. This was originally one of the things that was really leaned on for differentiation, was just the advertising. Oh, Cybertruck, great example. So if you go past advertising, let's go to the next slide, distribution. So I'm not sure how many people are watch folks or not, but go try and buy a Rolex at a jewelry store. It simply can't be done. They are purchased at Rolex boutiques only. And that says something about them being able to be distributed in their own stores. If you go to the next slide, packaging, just simply your packaging can be different. Potato chips in a tube, and water in a can. There are things that you can do just with packaging. We'll keep going. Media is an excellent example. I think Red Bull was the original people. They used YouTube as their media channel, and they didn't buy commercials. They just did killer content, posted on YouTube and reshared it. And so media can be fundamentally different. If you go to the next, this is obviously popular right now. Collaborations can be different. I mean, if you would have told me 10 years ago that Sharpie and Adidas would be making a special edition Stan Smith, I would have gone, what? But now it kind of makes sense. And collaborations allow two unlike companies to come together and be fundamentally different than they would be on their own. If you go to the next slide, customer experience can be different. And I think this is incredibly important for companies that maybe don't have a physical product. My daughter has gone to Reformation. I, of course, don't hang out in dressing rooms of women's clothing stores, but she's told me, no, Dad, the clothes come in through a back door in the dressing room. And so you pick out what you want. You tell them your size. You're in the dressing room and a discreet door opens up and you get a signal and you open it up and all your clothes are right there. Fundamentally different customer experience than going to a Gap or a Banana Republic where there's just that massive clothes rack and clothes are everywhere. If you go to the next slide, pricing. You can have fundamentally different pricing. They have flat pricing, low pricing, or in some cases, incredibly high pricing. But pricing can be something that makes you stand out for better or for worse. And then finally, they say that there are no longer the 4 P's of marketing: price, product, place, promotion, but there are now 5 P's: price, product, place, promotion, planet. And ethos and the sustainability aspect of products is also can be very different. So, so these is a pair of shoes that uses vegan leather and other things. So ethos can be different. So there is an entire range of ways in which you can differentiate. You do not have to feel like, oh my gosh, I need a completely different product design, or I need a big advertising budget. You have an entire toolkit that you can use to be different. If you go to the next slide, I do want to talk about honesty. And I want to spend a minute talking about Solo stoves. If you're not familiar with Solo stoves, you can go to the next slide. They bill themselves as the world's first smokeless fire pit. They have this beautifully designed fire pits. I have one in my home here, and they build themselves for a long time as a smokeless fire pit. But if you go to the next slide, they are far from smokeless. I have quite a few videos of mine belching out large volumes of thick black smoke. They are not smokeless in any way, shape, or form. What I've learned is that any fire becomes smokeless once it becomes hot enough. But when you light one of these things, it does nothing but belch out large volumes of smoke. And so they tried to differentiate themselves versus other outdoor fire products, is that theirs is smokeless. If you go on Reddit, you're going to find out they are not. They hired Snoop Dogg to, quote, announce that he was going smokeless as a PR and social stunt, that he was giving up smoke. They got tons of press all over the place. Very, very good press through this. But if you go to the next slide, Solo Stove CEO got canned following this campaign because it was fundamentally a stunt. But even more importantly, it was based on a feature that wasn't actually real in the real world, which was it was smokeless. And so it wasn't the case of the marketing person getting canned after the stunt. The CEO actually got fired. And so the lesson here is, when you try and differentiate yourself, you've got to be authentic and credible to what your product actually delivers or your service actually delivers. You can't just make something up that's wildly different. And so so let's fire up the chat again. We're going to end before we do some Q&A. I'm going to throw out some really difficult examples of some brands, and you guys can choose. But if you go to the next slide, you can choose one of these bikes. On the next slide, you can choose one of these cars, and these are all highly commoditized. These are all very, very, very familiar, but they're also very, very similar. And so this is not going to be an easy little assignment, but if you go to the slide after this, I think I've got a range of questions. Pick one of these brands and figure out, how could you price it differently? How could you design it differently? How could the customer experience be different? Could the advertising stand out? Can the immediate media approach be surprising? What about the packaging? What about an ethical or sustainability point of view? Is there a collaboration that makes sense? Can where they're be sold, can that be unusual? And so we'll just do a quick little fire up the chat here. I'm not expecting anybody to solve Toyota's woes over chat or come up with a killer idea for a new Trek bike over chat, but just give throw a couple of examples out before I wrap up, and then if there's questions, we can go to questions. And so Billy, keep me honest here. Here's an idea that somebody threw out for Toyota, given that they're an incredibly reliable car and the maintenance cost is less, is should they put something on their dashboard that says, this is how much you've saved in maintenance relative to the average car. And it's a rolling toll of dollars on your dashboard that says, look, if you drive a Toyota and the average maintenance cost is $178 a year, but the average car is $700 a year, that over the course of your car, you it has something on your dashboard that says how much you saved in maintenance relative to somebody else. Somebody else gave the idea of, could you take the idea of a specialized bike? And this came up at the Colorado College. Kids said, well, what if we really took specialized to its ultimate conclusion, which is, what if you were able to take a personality test, a mood test, and all these other battery of tests that are out there, and actually have a bike that was specially designed for you in terms of colors, functionality, everything else, and you took customization to the nth degree with specialized, where you could have every aspect of the bike specialized to you, your interest, your mood, your color likes, all that kind of stuff. So those are a couple ideas. I'm not sure anybody has anything in the chat. And then I've got a couple final thoughts before we go. Totally agree. Toyota does seem to be doing better than the other ones. Absolutely. And I think Toyota has done an incredible job of really leaning into the fact that that they are reliable. And I like the fact that, I like that. Yeah, riding a bike is way more sustainable. I think one of the things that Toyota has historically not fallen very high on is excitement and emotion. And the new CEO, which is the former chairman's son, I believe, is coming into Toyota, and his number one priority is to make Toyotas more emotional. And I think when you look at a Corolla or a Camry or some of those cars, or just, it makes sense that he's doing that. Thank you for those. Let me just end with a final thought here. And then if we want to do any Q&A, we can do that. I want to thank everybody for their attention during this. So Bill, if you go to the final slides, these all kind of roast through pretty quickly. Final thought here is, be courageous. You've got to have some creative courage here to stand out, and you have to be comfortable standing out. Next, you can't be afraid to stand out. That's got to be part of it. On the next slide, you got to dig deep. You actually don't take the first thing that comes to you as, oh, we could do this. You actually have to do some archaeology work around who you are as a company, what makes you special, and really dig deep and figure out how to bring that out so that people can see aspects of your company or your product that they might not normally see. Finally, be authentic to something that's true to your company. And then let's keep going. And then finally, don't blow smoke from our friends at Solo Stove. You can't make something up. You've got to be true. And I think that's it. And with that, I'll end it. And if there are questions, I'll take them. If not, everybody can take the remaining minutes and get their own coffee. Yeah. So how would you link differentiation to product market fit? Maybe I'll pause there. I see so many startups, and if not just startups, but any companies in the mid-market space, and they're all offering the same thing. And I see this all the time, particularly in payments, is, oh my gosh, there are all these issuer processors who are all in the exact same space. And yet they're all doing the same thing, and they're just hoping that they're going to outsell somebody else. Whereas the ones that are successful are the ones that pick a single attribute to really be meaningfully different on it, whether it's global coverage or something like that. And so I think it's really important for startups to do this as well. Ha! Hold on. Can we go back? I don't know if I can go back, but I wanted to read that one. What do we need to do to grow something as boring and restricted as pharmacy? So if I take something like this, I mean, it is incredible to me. I don't know if you're talking pharmacy or pharmaceuticals, but pharmaceuticals all have the exact same format to their ads. And yes, I realize there's all the legal disclosures that need to come come through it, but they all have the exact same format. They all look the same bad industrial video quality, even in the presentation of marketing for pharmaceuticals or pharmacy. I think there's a lot to be said there. And then again, within the context, I think if you just put me in with blinders on and walk me into a Duane Reade in New York, or a Walgreens, or a CVS, or a Rite Aid, if we're talking pharmacy, not pharmaceuticals, I wouldn't be able to tell where I was. The customer experience is essentially the exact same. The products are the same. The interior is the exact same. Everything's the exact same. And so I think if you're talking retail pharmacy, I think this is one thing that Target did incredibly well in the retail, is that they differentiated themselves incredibly in terms of the retail experience and the product mix from Walmart, and it's been able to survive where so many other companies did not. And so I think that the same opportunity avails itself there. I think the question that's on there, gosh, this is tough because I'm not an expert in all these different industries. But I think even in a business intelligence platform, of which I've subscribed to many of them, there's the how the intelligence is derived, and do you have a secret sauce related to that? And then there is also, to me, the delivery of it. Is there an ease of use of how the intellectual capital gets delivered? And so I do think that even on things that are platform or SaaS based, there is a way to differentiate them, again, in terms of, well, does the product come out a little bit easier? And I see this all the time with some of the MarTech platforms that we use, which is some of that's just easier. They're easier to plug and play, or it's easier to match company names to this database, and it's more fall off a log easy as opposed to technical. And so if you're trying to get technological adoption, in some cases, ease of use becomes way more important than technical accuracy. Well, this is my one. I can take this question a little more easily. Is what advice would you give to us who need to go back to teams who are not as confident and eager to stand out? And one of my favorite quotes was from the former CMO of Target, and it says, "When you meet resistance, teach." And I would say, given the discussion that we're having today, I think when people understand the value of standing out and the lunacy of blending in, particularly in environments when you don't have as many resources or not as much time, but you're actually blending in, that is not a viable path forward. So what I always do when I meet resistance and people who are getting pushback, I always use it as an opportunity to teach the benefits of standing out, so they really understand the science behind the power of differentiation. How do you begin a differentiation strategy with a competitor analysis? I think that's one step. I will say that in all of my years of doing this, almost always the answer is not with the competitors. The answer is with yourselves and your own company. And I would say the majority of that time, oftentimes it comes back to the DNA of the company of, hey, why did we start this? When did we get started? What was the thing that made us want to start this company? And I would say that half the time, the answer to what makes you different goes back to those very early days of when the company was started. And what typically happens is you lose sight of that as you grow and over time. And I can't tell you how many brand restages I've done where you're back to the future and you just go back. Let's go back to the early days and figure out what made you special in those early days. And 50% of the time, it's the exact same thing. People have just lost sight of it as the company has grown. Let me see this one. How to craft guidelines for the use of ethical language in the communication as a differentiation strategy. I'm not sure what I mean by ethical language. Anybody help me here? Craft guidelines for the use of ethical language in the communication as a differentiation. Oh, so it's okay. I think maybe what you're saying there is that how can you articulate your ethical advantage within the context of how you operate your organization as a means of differentiation. I think it's so well done. I think there's so many companies that have done such a good job of that, even when their product is not necessarily an ethical product. And I looked at companies like Aveda, Ben and Jerry's, Patagonia, where the product itself is not either ethical one way or the other, and yet they've done an incredible job of using language to dimensionalize the ethics that they use to drive how the company is run and the products are brought to market. I don't know if that helps or not, and I'm not sure if I'm answering the right question. Oh gosh, I'm not sure I can help you here, Maya, on this. How do you differentiate in the app space when all of them play on convenience? I would say in the app space also, I said everything is a tool. The icon's a tool, your description in the app store is a tool, your core user is a tool. Use everything in the toolkit to differentiate. Colors, everything, particularly if they're all playing on convenience. One of my favorite definitions of brand positioning is the role of brand positioning is to redefine the competitive playing field in a way that advantages you and disadvantages your competition. And so I would look through that lens of, is there a way that I can define the rules of competition in a way that really advantage me and disadvantage everyone else? And it allows you to define how you're going to compete. And that oftentimes helps. Yes, there's a recent Trout book called The Power of Positioning that's good. Honestly, I'm going to recommend this even though it's oblique. I see Irving's on this call, but I actually find that Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act, that came out last year, is incredibly helpful because a lot of it is around, it's an oblique recommendation, but it teaches you and gives you step-by-step instructions around how to unlock creativity. And I think it's incredibly useful, particularly given how many of these questions are, I'm in a highly commoditized, highly competitive space. How am I going to unlock some creativity? I think Rick Rubin's book, if you don't know who Rick Rubin is, music producer, very accomplished music producer, and he wrote a very digestible book called The Creative Act, very short chapters on how to unlock creativity. And I would say that would be a good path forward. Oh, let's see. Jay, when bringing a disruptive fintech solution to enterprise-sized retailers, how is differentiating factors best confused without getting lost in the details? Yeah, that gets to storytelling versus infotelling. And I think it depends on when is the point of differentiation best delivered. Because sometimes getting in the door, you need to be talking about your enterprise credentials. But once you're in the door, I think then you could say, let me leave you with one point that makes us fundamentally different from everyone else. So I think you can also choose your moment in the purchase decision journey as to when you want to play the differentiation card. You don't always have to play it at the trigger or the early stage of the decision. You can play that card later and say, hey, as you're leaving, or as you're leaving the sales engagement or sales meeting, you can leave them with it. Hey, before I leave, I want to leave you with one thing that is fundamentally different about us relative to everyone else. And that's going to play a slightly different role in having you stick in their mind than it would be on the front of it. Oh my gosh, how do you prove the value of differentiation? I will tell you, here's a very, very unique stat that I had in my past life. And that was that we were using differentiation to try and get into the consideration set. We were a highly commoditized category, and we were trying to be very, very different from the other organizations that we were competing with. And one of the things that we found is that our brand consideration went up along with brand differentiation, but our brand awareness actually went down, which is completely counterintuitive, which is, oh my gosh, our brand awareness went down, but our consideration went up. And that's because we weren't worried about trying to get massive brand awareness. We were just trying to stand out relative to the competition. So we were measuring ourselves on how distinctive we were, not how broad-based awareness we had. And we actually found that brand consideration went up at the same time brand awareness went down. So, Kara, how do you stand out as an internet provider? Boy, I think there are so many probably tried and true ways that have been attempted, maybe not work, but I think there, if you had to ask as someone who's on the other end of this, I would probably say the customer experience end of that, because I think so many people are dissatisfied with it, but that is an expensive proposition to dimensionalize and to try and differentiate on that aspect. But I do think because the internet providing the actual bandwidth is highly commoditized, it becomes, how do you either A, interact with the company that provides it and what's there, or one of my greatest examples, one of the brands that I think has just done an incredible job along this lines is T-Mobile. You know, T-Mobile's it's the exact same phones, exact same 3G, 4G, 5G network, exact same cell towers, exact same everything. But what I like about T-Mobile is they just said, we're the Un-carrier. We're just slightly different. They literally just claimed we're different. That's what they did. They didn't say we've got different phones, different plans, different anything. T-Mobile just went on and said, we're different than the other people. And so going back to ISPs, I would absolutely say you can just claim you're different. And it worked for T-Mobile like a charm. And so that would probably be a realistic option, which is just go out and claim that you're a different type of internet service provider, and that will get you differentiation, believe it or not. And this has happened, throughout history. There are many companies that just said, we're the, what was it? The Uncola, 7-Up, we're the Uncola, T-Mobile, we're the Un-carrier. So I think there's something there with that. All right, looks like we're at time. People are saying goodbye. Thanks, growth hackers.